I am Caleb, and I am 32 years old. For over 5 grueling years, my own flesh and blood treated me like a permanent stain on our seemingly perfect family tree, all while I was quietly building a massive financial empire in the absolute shadows. While I was standing in the blistering sun, dressed in a cheap, neon yellow valet vest at my younger cousin's extravagant graduation party, humiliated and ordered around like a common servant, my parents and my aunt laughed at my expense. My cousin Julian stood next to his brand new silver Porsche and told a crowd of 80 wealthy guests that it was great to have a real degree, unlike some people who waste their lives on little online hobbies. They all laughed at me right to my face while I held their car keys. But there was one massive, life-altering secret they did not know. My little online hobby had just cleared $1.2 million in pure, liquid profit, and that shiny new Porsche Julian was leaning against was entirely leased with a crushing, borderline illegal interest rate. Now, they are the ones begging me for a lifeline to save them from complete financial ruin and public humiliation. Before I tell you exactly how I destroyed their golden boy illusion and exposed the ugly truth to everyone they tried to impress, please hit that like button if you firmly believe in absolute justice. And don't forget to let me know in the comments exactly where you are watching from today. Let's go back to where this unbelievable nightmare began. The late afternoon sun was beating down relentlessly on the perfectly manicured lawn of my Aunt Beatrice's sprawling suburban estate. It was late June, and it was a suffocating kind of heat, the kind that makes your good-dressed clothes stick uncomfortably to your skin and makes your lungs feel heavy with every breath. The entire neighborhood was one of those strict HOA communities where every blade of grass had to be exactly 2 inches high. The air in the backyard smelled of expensive catered barbecue, sweet champagne, and the overwhelming, undeniable scent of pure entitlement. String lights were meticulously draped across the massive, century-old oak trees, and pristine white linen tents were set up across the grass, creating a picture-perfect backdrop for the ultimate celebration of absolute mediocrity. This was the graduation party for my cousin Julian. He was 24 years old, fresh out of a wildly expensive private university with a generic degree in communications, and he was the undisputed golden boy of our entire extended family. He had never worked a part-time job. He had never paid a single bill in his entire life. I was 32. I was standing near the edge of the blazing hot asphalt driveway, trying desperately to ignore the sweat dripping down the back of my neck and soaking into the collar of my shirt. I was not holding a glass of chilled champagne. I was not mingling with the guests, catching up with old relatives, or enjoying the catered brisket sliders. I was wearing a bright, obnoxious neon yellow vest over my clothes. I was holding a cheap plastic walkie-talkie that kept buzzing with irritating static. My Aunt Beatrice had explicitly called me 2 days prior and demanded I arrive 2 hours early to help out. She framed it as a simple family favor over the phone, claiming she just needed an extra set of hands for the decorations. But the exact moment I stepped out of my car, she marched up to me, shoved the neon vest into my chest, pointed to the street, and told me I was in charge of the parking situation. According to her, I had plenty of free time on my hands since my little internet thing was just a hobby that didn't require real working hours. I stood there on the hot pavement, watching my own relatives and my aunt's wealthy friends drive past me. Some of them waved dismissively, barely looking up from their glowing phone screens. Others rolled down their tinted windows just enough to blindly hand me their heavy key fobs without ever making eye contact. I parked their luxury sedans, their massive heavy-duty SUVs, and their sleek sports cars, carefully wedging them along the edges of the property and jogging back to the front gate so I wouldn't keep the next guest waiting. Every time I walked back up the long, steep driveway, my legs burning from the physical exertion, I could hear the booming, arrogant laughter echoing from the backyard. I could hear my own mother, Eleanor, projecting her voice over the crowd. She was bragging about Julian to anyone who would listen, talking about him as if she had given birth to him herself. She was telling complete strangers about his incredible potential and his brilliant future. Julian was holding court by the massive stone patio near the pool. He was wearing a custom-tailored, cream-colored linen suit that probably cost more than my first car. He had a crystal flute of expensive champagne in his hand, throwing his head back in practiced, theatrical laughter every time someone made a toast in his honor. Standing right behind him, glistening under the afternoon sun, was the centerpiece of the entire party. A brand new Porsche. It was silver, sleek, and aggressively tied with a massive, ridiculous red ribbon on the hood. It was presented as a graduation gift from his parents. A grand reward for simply doing the bare minimum and coasting through 4 years of college while living in a luxury apartment paid for by Aunt Beatrice. My Uncle Richard walked past me on his way to the garage. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not thank me for standing in the brutal heat for 2 straight hours parking cars for his golf buddies. He simply snapped his fingers at me, pointed at a massive white cooler sitting near the garage door, and told me they were running low on ice. He told me to stop standing around and be quick about it so the guests would not have to drink warm beverages. He spoke to me exactly the way he would speak to a hired hand who was moving far too slowly for his liking. I looked down at my hands. They were covered in dark dust and black grease from handling steering wheels and dirty car door handles all afternoon. I looked at my uncle's retreating back as he walked away without a second glance. Then I looked at the crowd gathered on the lawn. My mother was standing right next to the shiny new Porsche, pointing at it, beaming with absolute, unadulterated pride. For a fraction of a second, she caught my eye. We locked eyes across the yard. She did not smile. She did not give me a comforting wave. She just quickly looked away, her face tightening, clearly ashamed that her own son was nothing more than the hired help at a family gathering. A cold, heavy knot formed deep in my stomach, chilling me despite the summer heat. The blatant disrespect was not entirely new. It was a cruel language they had been speaking to me for years. But seeing it manifest physically like this, seeing myself literally reduced to a servant in a neon vest while they raised their glasses to a guy who had never worked a hard day in his entire privileged life, pushed something deep inside my chest past the absolute breaking point. I gripped the heavy, freezing plastic bag of ice until my knuckles turned stark white. I dragged it across the grass, feeling the judgmental eyes of my relatives burning into my back. How did I end up here? How did a 32-year-old man allow his family to strip away his dignity piece by piece until nothing was left? I had spent years trying to earn my rightful place at their table, trying to prove my worth, only to be handed a walkie-talkie and pointed toward the driveway. To truly understand the sheer scale of the emotional betrayal and the absolute perfection of what I was about to do to them at this very party, we have to rewind the clock back 5 years. I thought the worst was behind me. I was so incredibly wrong. 5 years ago, my life looked entirely different to the outside world. I was working a stable, highly demanding corporate job at a logistics firm. I was working 60 to 70 hours a week, destroying my physical and mental health for a company that saw me as nothing more than a number on a spreadsheet. When a major promotion I had been promised for 2 years was suddenly given to the CEO's completely unqualified nephew, something inside me snapped. I made the terrifying, life-altering decision to walk away from the corporate world entirely. I had zero interest in climbing a broken ladder that led to absolutely nowhere. I wanted to build something of my own from the ground up. I immediately moved out of my nice townhouse and into a tiny, cramped, deeply depressing apartment on the bad side of town. The walls were paper-thin, and the heating barely worked in the winter. I sold almost everything of value I owned, including my reliable car, and poured every single penny of my life savings into building an e-commerce brand. I started small, sourcing custom tech accessories and building a streamlined online storefront. The first 2 years were an absolute living nightmare. I barely slept more than 4 hours a night. I lived on a strict diet of cheap instant noodles, tap water, and black coffee. My best friend and eventual business partner, Marcus, was the only person on earth who actually saw the vision. We spent countless exhausting nights staring at incredibly complex spreadsheets, negotiating fiercely with international suppliers halfway across the world at 3 in the morning, and packing hundreds of cardboard boxes on my dirty living room floor until our hands literally bled and blistered. It was grueling, terrifying, back-breaking work, but it was mine. My family, however, saw things entirely differently. In their highly judgmental eyes, leaving a corporate job with a matching retirement fund and a steady salary was a massive, unforgivable failure. Whenever we gathered for our traditional Thanksgiving dinners, the atmosphere was always thick with tension. My mother, Eleanor, would loudly apologize for my life choices to anyone who would listen. She would stand in the kitchen, aggressively carving the dry turkey, and tell my aunts and uncles that I was going through a very concerning, deeply embarrassing phase. She consistently referred to my grueling business as a little online hobby. She told the entire extended family that I was just confused, lost, and stubbornly refusing to grow up and face reality. She would sigh dramatically, clutching her pearls, and say she just hoped I would find a real job before I went completely bankrupt and had to move back into her basement. Meanwhile, Julian was the undisputed rising star of the family universe. He was still in high school back then, but he was treated like absolute royalty. If Julian managed to get a mediocre B- on a basic history test, my Aunt Beatrice and Uncle Richard would throw a catered dinner party to celebrate his academic genius. Beatrice would boast endlessly at her neighborhood association meetings about Julian's imaginary, highly lucrative future in corporate law. He was given everything on a shiny silver platter. He had a massive college fund waiting for him, funded by my grandparents before they passed. He had brand new designer clothes, a paid-off luxury sedan for his 16th birthday, and absolutely zero responsibilities to speak of. The glaring contrast between us became the central, running joke of the family. I was the tragic cautionary tale. Julian was the perfect blueprint for success. But there were major things I did behind the scenes that nobody in the family knew about. When my grandfather passed away, it tore a massive, ugly hole in our family dynamic. After the incredibly tense funeral, my grandmother was left completely alone, struggling with a fixed income and rapidly mounting, terrifying medical bills. Instead of stepping up, my mother and Aunt Beatrice spent months bitterly arguing over a meager inheritance. They actually brought in a ruthless lawyer to bicker over antique dining room furniture, dusty silver spoons, and the potential sale of my grandmother's real estate, rather than actually helping the woman who raised them. When my grandmother desperately needed a specialized, life-saving heart surgery that her insurance absolutely refused to cover, the family suddenly went completely silent. Beatrice loudly claimed all their money was tied up in aggressive real estate investments. My mother claimed she was saving every penny for her retirement and simply couldn't afford to help. They were going to let her die to protect their bank accounts. I did not say a single word to them. I quietly liquidated a significant portion of my early business profits, nearly draining my operating capital. I walked directly into the hospital billing department and paid the $30,000 invoice in full with a certified cashier's check. I explicitly told the hospital administration to list it as an anonymous charitable donation. I did not want their fake praise. I did not want a parade in my honor. I just wanted my grandmother to be safe and healthy. 2 weeks later, at a tense family Sunday dinner, my mother confidently raised her glass of wine. She proudly announced to the entire table that the massive hospital bill had been magically paid off by an anonymous donor. And then, without skipping a beat or showing an ounce of shame, she smiled warmly at Aunt Beatrice and said it must have been a secret blessing from the surplus in Julian's college fund. She actually fabricated an entire, elaborate story right there at the dinner table that Richard and Beatrice had secretly covered the massive medical bill to protect their beloved mother. Beatrice did not deny it. She just placed a hand over her heart, looked incredibly humble, and graciously accepted the tearful gratitude of the entire table. I sat at the far end of the table, silently eating my cold mashed potatoes, watching them shamelessly steal my massive sacrifice to polish Julian's fake halo. Marcus told me I was completely insane. He told me I needed to pack my bags, change my phone number, and leave these highly toxic people behind forever. But I was foolish and deeply conditioned. I desperately believed in the unbreakable bond of family. I believed that eventually, they would see my incredibly hard work and respect me. I thought I just needed to become more successful to earn their love. The real turning point, the exact moment the glass shattered completely and irreparably, happened 6 months before the graduation party. It was a freezing cold, rainy Tuesday evening. I had stopped by my mother's house to drop off some heavy groceries she had urgently asked for. Her car was in the driveway, and Aunt Beatrice's massive luxury SUV was parked right behind it. I unlocked the front door quietly with my spare key, not wanting to interrupt whatever they were doing. As I walked down the dark hallway toward the kitchen, holding the heavy grocery bags, I heard their voices echoing sharply from the dining room. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. Beatrice was complaining loudly about my business. She was saying it was downright embarrassing to the family name that I was still pushing cheap plastic junk on the internet at my age. I held my breath. I fully expected my mother to defend me. I expected her to say I was working hard, that I was trying my best to build a life. Instead, my mother let out a soft, incredibly cruel, mocking laugh. She told Beatrice that my failure was actually a good thing. She said, and these exact words are permanently burned into my brain, "Let him play with his little websites, B. As long as he keeps failing and struggling, he will always need me. If he ever actually made real money, he would leave and I would never see him. I like him right where he is. It makes Julian look even better by comparison. Anyway." I stood in the dark hallway, completely unable to breathe. My own mother, the woman who was supposed to be my greatest advocate, my protector, was actively rooting for my total financial and emotional destruction. She was deliberately manipulating the family narrative to ensure I remained the designated loser, just so she could constantly play the role of the tragic, long-suffering mother to her friends. She was gladly feeding me to the wolves to keep her sister happy and to elevate her golden nephew. I did not march in there and confront them. I did not scream or throw the groceries. I gently set the bags down on the hardwood floor, turned around, walked out the front door, and quietly closed it behind me. I got into my car and drove away into the freezing night rain. I realized in that exact moment that my own mother was the chief architect of my absolute misery. I stopped seeking her approval that night. I stopped wishing for a supportive family that simply did not exist. I started plotting my permanent exit from their toxic web. And I focused entirely, ruthlessly, on building my empire. I thought the worst emotional pain was finally over. I was so incredibly wrong. The real storm was just gathering. By the time the heavy, ridiculously expensive gold-foiled invitation for Julian's graduation party arrived in my mailbox, my business had absolutely exploded beyond my wildest expectations. Marcus and I had successfully secured 3 massive international distribution deals that changed everything. We had completely moved out of my dingy apartment and leased a massive, state-of-the-art commercial warehouse facility on the edge of the city. I now had a full-time staff of 20 dedicated employees. I had hired a ruthless, highly expensive corporate lawyer to completely restructure our LLC, set up holding companies, and aggressively protect my rapidly growing assets from any future liabilities or greedy relatives. My personal salary was drawing deep into the 6 figures, and the business itself was generating incredible, life-changing revenue month over month. I had quietly purchased a beautiful, modern, 4-bedroom home on the affluent side of the city, paying the massive down payment in cash. I did not tell a single member of my family any of this. I let them keep firmly believing I was still barely scraping by in a tiny, dangerous apartment, eating ramen noodles and constantly struggling to pay my basic electric bill. I wanted them to show me exactly who they were. Aunt Beatrice called me exactly 1 week before the graduation party. Her voice was dripping with that fake, sugary sweetness she only ever used when she wanted to deeply exploit someone. She excitedly told me it was going to be the absolute event of the season for the entire neighborhood. She practically screamed into the phone, aggressively name-dropping several local politicians, wealthy real estate developers, and prominent business owners who were attending to honor her perfect son. Then, without missing a beat, she casually dropped the hammer on me. "Caleb, honey, we are going to need you to come a little early on Saturday. The catering company we hired is terribly short-staffed, and we desperately need someone reliable to manage the parking situation out front. It is a very big responsibility with all these expensive cars, but I know you have a very flexible schedule with your little internet hobby. It will be a huge help to Julian on his big day. You owe it to the family." I wanted to say no. I wanted to laugh in her face, tell her to hire a professional valet company, and hang up the phone forever. But a dark, quiet, highly calculating voice in the back of my mind told me to go. I wanted to see it with my own eyes. I wanted to see exactly how far they would push their blatant disrespect now that Julian had his useless degree. I agreed in a quiet, submissive tone. When I arrived at the massive estate that afternoon, the reality was much more degrading than a simple request for family help. Beatrice had actually hired a professional valet manager, a loud, aggressive man with a clipboard and a silver whistle around his neck. But she had specifically instructed him to use me as his unpaid personal runner. The manager literally shoved a sweaty, oversized, incredibly ugly neon vest into my chest the exact moment I walked up the driveway. He aggressively handed me a walkie-talkie, pointed a thick finger at the street, and told me to hustle because the VIP guests were arriving and he didn't want any scratches on their luxury cars. I slowly put the vest on over my nice button-down shirt. I stood at the end of the blazing hot driveway like a human traffic cone. I watched my family members arrive one by one, dressed in their absolute best. The absolute worst, most deeply insulting moment was when my younger cousin Liam pulled up. Liam was 3 years younger than me. 3 years ago, his life had completely imploded. He was facing a brutal, highly contentious custody battle and a horribly messy divorce. His vengeful ex-wife was taking him to the cleaners in court. He was dead broke, sleeping on a friend's dirty basement couch, and completely desperate. He had begged the family for help, and everyone, including Beatrice and my mother, turned their backs on him. I had quietly transferred $5,000 of my own hard-earned money directly to his bank account to pay his aggressive lawyer so he would not lose access to his 2 young kids. He had promised me, with literal tears streaming down his face, to pay me back the moment he got on his feet. He never sent me a single dime. Liam pulled up to the graduation party in a shiny, brand-new heavy-duty truck. He rolled down the tinted window. He looked at me standing there sweating in the neon vest, looked down at my dusty dress shoes, and smirked. A real arrogant smirk. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not say thank you for saving his entire life and his relationship with his children 3 years ago. He just tossed his heavy keyring violently out the window. The keys hit my chest hard and fell clattering onto the burning asphalt. He laughed a cruel laugh, explicitly told me not to scratch his expensive custom paint job, and walked up the driveway to join the wealthy party, leaving me to bend down and pick up his mess. I slowly picked up the keys. I got into the truck. I parked it perfectly. I swallowed the burning, acidic rage rising rapidly in my throat. I told myself to stay perfectly calm. The trap was already set. An hour later, the massive parking rush finally slowed down, and the valet manager told me I could take a quick 15-minute break. I walked up to the sprawling, noisy backyard. The party was in full swing. A massive, professionally printed banner hung across the wide patio reading, "Julian, a future leader." Dozens of waiters in crisp white shirts and black ties were carrying silver trays of expensive appetizers and crystal glasses of champagne. Then came the grand, highly anticipated reveal. Aunt Beatrice aggressively grabbed a microphone from the hired DJ booth and demanded everyone's absolute attention. She gave a tearful, highly dramatic speech about how incredibly hard Julian had worked, how he had overcome so many immense obstacles, which was entirely fictional, considering he had a highly paid private tutor for every single subject since middle school and a massive allowance. She pointed dramatically to the driveway. Uncle Richard proudly grabbed the corner of a massive silver tarp and ripped it off the vehicle parked near the garage. It was the silver Porsche. The wealthy crowd gasped loudly and erupted into deafening applause. Julian walked over, looking incredibly smug and thoroughly self-satisfied, and leaned against the expensive hood for dozens of photos. My mother was standing right in the front row, clapping so hard her hands were visibly red. I walked over to the crowded beverage table, desperate to get a simple glass of ice water. Standing right there next to the punch bowl was Chloe. Chloe was Julian's ex-girlfriend. They had broken up very messily 2 months ago, but she was invited purely because her wealthy parents were close business friends with Richard and Beatrice. Chloe looked at me in my vest, looked back at the crowd aggressively cheering for Julian, and rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might permanently get stuck in her head. She poured herself a very heavy, overflowing glass of red wine and leaned in incredibly close to me, smelling strongly of alcohol and expensive perfume. "They are absolutely, completely insane," she whispered harshly, shaking her head in utter disgust. "Do they actually think he is some kind of massive success?" I looked at her, genuinely confused by her tone. "What do you mean, Chloe? He just graduated from a top-tier school. They bought him a brand new Porsche. He must have a massive corporate job lined up in the city." Chloe let out a sharp, bitter, highly sarcastic laugh. "Bought it? Caleb, are you blind? That car is completely leased. And Richard didn't even put his own name on the financial paperwork because his credit is tied up. Julian leased it himself to look rich and powerful for his frat brothers. His credit cards are completely maxed out to the absolute limit. He is facing a potential lawsuit from a major creditor. He has aggressively failed 3 consecutive job interviews because he shows up late and acts like he owns the entire building. He is drowning in massive, suffocating debt, and his parents are quietly covering his incredibly expensive apartment rent so nobody in the family finds out the pathetic truth." I stood there, frozen, staring at her as the incredible information processed in my brain. The golden boy was a complete and utter financial fraud. The entire narrative, the superiority, the extreme arrogance, it was all built on a massive, crumbling mountain of high-interest debt and toxic parental delusions. They were actively mocking me for building a real, highly profitable business from the ground up, while they were financing a total lie just to maintain appearances. I quietly thanked Chloe for the drink and the insight. I held onto that incredible piece of information like a loaded gun, and I knew precisely when I was going to pull the trigger to cause maximum damage. The aggressive catering staff began loudly ushering the dozens of guests toward the massive dining area on the lawn. There were 10 massive round tables elegantly draped in crisp white linen, adorned with towering, incredibly expensive floral centerpieces that probably cost $1,000 each. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the lawn, scanning the elegant, calligraphy-written place cards, looking for my name. I checked Table 1, where the immediate family, the wealthy politicians, and the guest of honor were seated. My name was obviously not there. I checked Table 2. Not there either. I checked Table 3, 4, and 5. I finally found my name. It was on a tiny, incredibly wobbly plastic folding table pushed all the way to the absolute back corner of the yard. It was positioned directly next to the incredibly noisy industrial ice maker and a massive, foul-smelling stack of black trash bags waiting to be taken to the curb by the caterers. I was seated with a few of the younger, highly restless children who were throwing food, and an elderly neighbor who was severely hard of hearing and kept asking where she was. It was a physical, undeniable, deeply insulting manifestation of my exact place in this toxic family. Out of sight, completely out of mind, seated right next to the literal garbage. I sat down in the cheap, bending plastic chair. I did not complain. I did not throw a fit or demand to speak to my aunt. I sat in perfect silence. I looked across the expansive yard and made direct, sustained eye contact with Grandpa Joe. He was sitting at the very center of the main table, looking deeply uncomfortable in his stiff suit. He looked at my degrading seating arrangement, looked at my dirty neon valet vest still hanging over the back of my plastic chair, and his wrinkled face hardened in absolute disgust. He gave me a slow, silent, deeply respectful nod of absolute understanding. He knew exactly what his daughters were doing to me. I slowly pulled out my smartphone. I opened my highly secure banking app. I completely bypassed the standard personal checking account and logged securely into the main corporate financial dashboard for Vanguard Tech. I stared at the bright white numbers glowing on the dark screen. The available, highly liquid cash balance in the primary operating account was exactly $1.2 million. That was just the liquid cash sitting there waiting to be deployed. It did not include the massive commercial warehouse real estate I owned, the massive amount of valuable inventory in transit, or my highly diversified, rapidly growing personal investments. I locked my phone and slipped it calmly back into my pocket. A wave of absolute, untouchable, euphoric calm washed over my entire body. They could put me next to the trash cans. They could dress me in a humiliating neon vest. They could force me to park their cars. But they could absolutely not touch my reality. I was the wealthiest man on this entire property, and none of them had a single clue. As the incredibly lavish, multi-course dinner progressed, guests began mingling, drinking heavily, and walking around the beautiful property. I remained entirely in my dark corner, quietly drinking my ice water, watching the absolute circus unfold. Suddenly, a man in a very sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit wandered over toward the loud ice machine. He looked completely out of place, clearly trying to escape the loud pop music and the forced, highly fake conversation at the main tables. I recognized him immediately from the cover of a prominent local business journal. His name was Mr. Sterling, a highly successful, self-made logistics CEO and apparently a wealthy business associate of Uncle Richard's. He smiled politely as he waited for the loud ice maker to cycle and drop ice into his glass. "Quite the extravagant party," he said, adjusting his incredibly expensive luxury watch. "Richard really went all out for the kid. Must have cost a fortune." "It certainly is a massive spectacle," I replied smoothly, leaning back in my cheap chair. He suddenly noticed the subtle, professional corporate logo embroidered on the dark polo shirt I was wearing under my unzipped jacket. It was the logo of my company, Vanguard Tech. His sharp eyebrows shot up in genuine, unhidden surprise. "Wait just a minute. Are you with Vanguard Tech, the rapidly growing e-commerce firm?" I nodded, standing up a little straighter and extending my hand. "I am the founder and CEO. My name is Caleb." Mr. Sterling's face completely lit up with absolute delight. He grabbed my hand and shook it firmly. He stepped much closer, completely ignoring the noisy ice machine and the party happening behind him. "You have got to be kidding me. My entire massive procurement team has been trying desperately to figure out your exact supply chain model for 6 solid months. You guys are dominating the market right now. How on earth are you maintaining those rapid, incredibly efficient shipping times from overseas without bleeding all your operating capital on stateside warehousing?" I smiled. We started talking business. I confidently explained my highly complex distributed fulfillment strategy, the proprietary AI software my engineering team had custom-built from scratch to dynamically route inventory, and the massive, highly lucrative recent shipping contracts I had successfully negotiated in Asia. Sterling was completely fascinated. He was treating me with more respect in 5 minutes than my family had shown me in 32 years. He pulled out a sleek, minimalist metal business card from his jacket pocket and was just about to hand it to me, asking to set up a formal lunch meeting, when Aunt Beatrice suddenly materialized out of nowhere like a complete nightmare. She rushed over in her high heels, her heavily makeup-covered face tight with absolute, unhinged panic. She clearly thought I was bothering a wealthy VIP guest, begging for a job, and ruining her perfect, highly curated party. "Oh, Mr. Sterling," Beatrice chirped loudly, aggressively stepping physically between the two of us and turning her back completely to me. "I am so incredibly sorry about this. Caleb can be very talkative and he simply doesn't know when to stop bothering important people. Please come back to the main table immediately." Julian was just telling a truly fascinating story about his highly competitive summer internship in Washington. She turned her head slightly, glaring at me over her shoulder with eyes full of pure, absolute venom. "Caleb, please go check if the valet manager needs you right now. The party is getting very busy, and we desperately need you out front doing your job." She was literally shooing me away like a stray, filthy dog sniffing around her expensive patio furniture. Mr. Sterling looked at Beatrice, completely baffled and highly offended by her blatant, aggressive rudeness. He looked back at me, gave a firm, deeply respectful nod acknowledging my authority and position, and reluctantly allowed himself to be forcefully dragged away by my frantic, oblivious aunt. I did not go back to the valet stand. I did not leave the yard. I stood my absolute ground right there on the grass, my heart pounding with pure adrenaline. 10 minutes later, the loud music suddenly faded out completely. The massive crowd murmured and quickly settled down into their expensive seats. Julian stood up slowly from the center table, smoothing down his expensive linen jacket. He unbuttoned it with a practiced, arrogant flourish, grabbed a wireless microphone from the hired DJ, and walked confidently to the very front of the massive stone patio. He tapped the microphone twice with his finger. The sharp, piercing electronic feedback echoed loudly across the entire manicured lawn, demanding absolute silence. The golden boy was about to give his grand, highly rehearsed graduation speech. He truly thought he was about to permanently cement his legacy as the absolute pride of the family. He had absolutely no idea he was standing blindly at the edge of a massive cliff, and I was about to gladly, forcefully push him over the edge in front of everyone he ever wanted to impress. The entire backyard fell into a hushed, reverent silence as Julian stood at the center of the massive stone patio. The string lights above him cast a warm, golden glow on his expensive linen suit. He held the wireless microphone with the casual confidence of a man who firmly believed the entire world revolved around him. He looked out over the crowd of 80 wealthy guests, his family members, and the hired catering staff. He smiled that signature, arrogant smile that Aunt Beatrice had spent 24 years cultivating. I remained seated at my tiny, wobbly folding table next to the industrial ice maker, completely hidden in the dark corner of the yard. I kept my neon yellow valet vest draped over the back of my cheap plastic chair. I crossed my arms and watched the spectacle unfold. Julian cleared his throat, leaning slightly into the microphone. Thank you. Thank you all so incredibly much for being here today to celebrate this milestone. You know, looking out at all of you, I am just overwhelmed with profound gratitude. He paused, placing a hand dramatically over his heart. It was a perfectly rehearsed gesture. Growing up in this family, surrounded by such incredible examples of success, I always knew I had massive shoes to fill. My parents, Richard and Beatrice, gave me the ultimate foundation. They taught me the true value of hard work, dedication, and the importance of an elite education. Aunt Beatrice dabbed at her dry eyes with a monogrammed napkin. Uncle Richard puffed out his chest, looking incredibly proud. Julian continued, his voice dripping with condescension. In today's fast-paced world, it is so incredibly easy to get distracted. It is so easy to look for shortcuts, to avoid putting in the real, grueling work required to build a legacy. We see it all the time, don't we? He let out a soft, mocking chuckle, looking directly toward the area where the younger cousins were seated. People trying to find easy money, avoiding the traditional path, wasting their absolute prime years on little online hobbies, hoping to strike it rich without a real degree or a real foundation. The silence in the yard shifted. It was no longer reverent. It was tense. Julian's eyes scanned the crowd and, for a brief, intentional second, they locked directly onto the dark corner where I was sitting. He knew exactly what he was doing. But a real degree, Julian projected his voice louder, holding up his expensive champagne flute. A degree from a prestigious university, that means something. It signifies discipline. It signifies true intellect. It opens the doors to actual, meaningful careers, not just virtual storefronts selling cheap junk from a cramped apartment. Some of us actually put in the 4 years of grueling work to earn a place at the adult table. Sorry, but I am absolutely not sorry for saying it. He smiled brightly, raising his glass higher. To real education, real jobs, and a very bright future. The reaction was immediate and absolutely sickening. The crowd erupted into loud, genuine laughter. It wasn't polite chuckling. It was deep, mocking laughter. I watched my cousin Liam throw his head back and laugh loudly, slapping the table. I watched Uncle Richard snort and shake his head in amusement. But the absolute worst part, the knife that twisted deepest in my gut, was watching my own mother. Eleanor put her hand over her mouth, her shoulders shaking as she tried to contain her laughter. She looked across the yard, her eyes briefly meeting mine again, and she gave me a tight, incredibly ashamed smile, as if she had been caught doing something naughty but simply couldn't help herself. They were laughing at me, publicly, in front of politicians, wealthy business owners, and complete strangers. They had stripped me of my dignity, dressed me like a servant, seated me next to the garbage, and now they were using my life as the punchline to elevate their fraudulent golden boy. I did not feel anger anymore. The burning rage I had felt earlier in the driveway completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a cold, sharp, absolutely terrifying clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when you finally realize you have absolutely nothing left to lose and owe these people absolutely nothing. I slowly stood up from my cheap plastic chair. I did not rush. I brushed a piece of lint off my dark polo shirt. I walked out from the dark corner of the yard, stepping onto the perfectly manicured grass, and made my way straight down the center aisle between the massive, expensive dining tables. The laughter began to die down as people noticed me walking forward. The wealthy guests looked confused. They probably thought the valet was coming up to make an announcement about a parked car. Aunt Beatrice's smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. She started waving her hands frantically, trying to silently shoo me back into the shadows. My mother's eyes widened in horror. I ignored all of them. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Julian. I walked right up to the front of the massive stone patio. Julian lowered the microphone, his arrogant smile freezing on his face. He clearly did not expect me to actually respond. He thought I was the broken, submissive dog they had beaten down for years. "Hey, Julian," I said. My voice was completely calm, incredibly clear, and loud enough that the first 3 rows of tables could hear every single word without a microphone. Julian blinked, looking highly uncomfortable. "Caleb, what are you doing?" "I am in the middle of a speech." I smiled. A genuine, relaxed smile. "I know. I just wanted to come up here and personally congratulate you. It really must feel absolutely incredible knowing that your prestigious degree got you to this exact moment. And it is truly awesome that your parents support you so aggressively." Julian puffed his chest out slightly, thinking I was actually backing down and submitting to him in front of the crowd. Yeah, thanks. Hard work pays off." I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him. The entire yard was dead silent now. You could hear the wind rustling through the massive oak trees. "It really does," I said, raising my voice just a fraction so the people at the back tables could hear me. "By the way, my little online hobby, the one you just mentioned, the virtual storefront selling cheap junk, it just cleared $1.2 million in pure, liquid profit this fiscal year. I own a commercial warehouse. I have 20 full-time employees." The silence instantly turned into a vacuum. It felt like all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the entire backyard. I didn't stop. I turned my head slightly, looking directly at the shiny silver vehicle parked near the garage. "But hey, Julian, that is a really nice Porsche. It's a shame about that crushing lease agreement, though. I hear the interest rates for someone with completely maxed out credit cards and 3 failed job interviews are absolutely brutal right now. You should really be careful. The repo men are much faster than they used to be." Someone at table 2 literally dropped a silver fork onto a porcelain plate. The sharp clatter echoed like a gunshot. Julian's face drained of all color. He looked like he had just been physically struck by a freight train. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, to call me a liar, but absolutely nothing came out. He just stood there, clutching the microphone, his perfectly tailored linen suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. I turned my attention to Aunt Beatrice and Uncle Richard. They were frozen in their expensive chairs. Richard's mouth was hanging wide open, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple. Beatrice was gripping the edge of the table so hard her manicured nails were digging into the white linen. Finally, I looked directly at my mother. Eleanor was blinking rapidly, completely paralyzed, staring at me as if I was a complete stranger who had just broken into her house. The narrative she had carefully constructed for years, the lie that kept her feeling superior, had just been completely, violently obliterated in front of her entire social circle. I did not wait for the screaming to start. I did not wait for Beatrice to throw a tantrum or for Julian to start crying. I simply gave a polite, incredibly brief nod to the crowd. I looked over at Mr. Sterling, who was sitting at table 3. He was leaning back in his chair, a slow, highly impressed smirk spreading across his face. He raised his glass of scotch to me in a silent salute. I turned on my heel and walked away. I walked back down the center aisle, my head held incredibly high. I reached the tiny folding table in the back corner. I picked up the obnoxious neon yellow valet vest. I walked over to the stack of black trash bags, dropped the vest directly into the garbage, and walked out the heavy iron front gates of the estate. As I walked down the long, winding suburban road toward my parked car, I could feel the intense stares piercing my back like heat lamps. The absolute chaos erupted behind me. I heard Beatrice shriek my name. I heard loud, overlapping voices. But I did not turn around. I did not need to. I had played my final part in their miserable play. I had dropped a massive bomb on their fragile glass house, and I had absolutely no intention of sticking around to clean up the shattered glass. When I finally got into my car and closed the heavy door, shutting out the noise of the neighborhood, I let out a massive, shuddering breath. For the first time in 32 years, the crushing weight of their expectations, their judgment, and their toxic cruelty was completely gone. I started the engine and drove back to my actual life. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The aftermath of the graduation party did not happen all at once. It rolled in like a dark, relentless thunderstorm over the next 48 hours. When I arrived home that evening and parked in the pristine garage of my 4-bedroom house, I pulled my phone out of my pocket. It was practically vibrating out of my hand. The notifications were rolling in so fast the screen was glitching. First came the frantic, aggressive text messages. My mother was the first to strike. "Caleb, what is wrong with you? That was completely uncalled for. You ruined Julian's entire graduation. You humiliated this entire family in front of very important people. You are a liar and a deeply bitter person. Call me immediately." I swiped the notification away. I didn't feel a single ounce of guilt. Then came Aunt Beatrice. She sent a massive block of text that must have taken her 10 minutes to type through her tears. "You vindictive, horrible little boy. Julian worked so incredibly hard for his degree, and you had to try and steal his spotlight with your disgusting lies. You are banned from this house. Nobody believes your pathetic delusion about making $1 million. Do not ever speak to my son again." Then came Liam, the cousin who owed me $5,000. "Bro, that was messed up. You didn't have to do Julian like that in front of his friends. Not cool." I walked into my quiet, perfectly temperature-controlled kitchen. I tossed my phone onto the marble island countertop. I poured myself a glass of expensive bourbon, walked out to my back patio, and looked at the stars. I didn't reply to a single message. I let them sit in the uncomfortable, terrifying silence. Let them wonder. Let them panic. That night, I slept better than I had in 5 long years. The real twist, the absolute peak of their unhinged audacity, happened 2 days later, on a quiet Monday afternoon. I was sitting in my spacious corner office at the Vanguard Tech warehouse, reviewing a highly lucrative supply chain contract, when my personal cell phone rang. The caller ID flashed brightly on the desk. It was Uncle Richard. I stared at the phone for a long moment. Beatrice had just banned me from their family forever. My mother had called me a liar. Why on earth was Richard calling me during business hours? I pressed a button on my desk phone to start a digital audio recording. In my line of work, you always keep receipts. I picked up the cell phone and answered with a highly professional tone. "Caleb speaking." "Caleb, hey buddy. It's Uncle Richard." His voice came through the speaker. It was not angry. It was not screaming. It was overly casual, forced, and sickeningly friendly. It was the exact tone of a desperate man trying to pretend the house wasn't actively on fire. "Hello, Richard," I replied coldly. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I thought Beatrice banned me from the family." Richard let out a nervous, highly forced chuckle. "Oh, you know Beatrice. She gets very emotional. She didn't mean any of that. Look, Caleb, about the party. It got a little heated, sure. Julian had a few too many drinks, he made a bad joke, and you fired back. It's water under the bridge, right? We are all family here." I leaned back in my heavy leather office chair, my eyes narrowing. A bad joke? He publicly humiliated my career in front of 80 people. And my own mother laughed. I know, Richard said quickly, completely brushing past my trauma. And he feels terrible about it. He really does. He's just under a lot of extreme stress right now. Finding a corporate job in this current market is tough for a young kid. He cleared his throat loudly. Actually, Caleb, that is sort of why I am calling you. I remained completely silent. I let the awkwardness stretch over the phone line, forcing him to speak into the void. "So," Richard finally stammered, the fake confidence draining from his voice. "I was thinking about what you said, about your business doing so incredibly well. Over $1 million in profit, right? That is just phenomenal, Caleb. I always knew you had a head for business. I told Beatrice years ago, that kid is going places." It was a blatant, disgusting lie. He had called me a failure to my face for years. "Get to the point, Richard." Richard took a deep, shaking breath. "Well, you see, the thing about Julian's new Porsche, you were actually right. It is a lease. And due to some unfortunate, temporary cash flow issues with my real estate investments this quarter, I couldn't put my name on the final paperwork. Julian had to secure the financing himself. And, well, the interest rate the dealership gave him is a little aggressive." "Aggressive?" I echoed, enjoying every single second of his absolute misery. "Yes, and since Julian hasn't secured his executive position yet, the first 2 lease payments are coming due on Friday. If he misses them, they are going to repossess the car. It would completely ruin his credit before he even starts his life. It would absolutely destroy Beatrice. So I was just thinking, since we are family and you are doing so incredibly well right now, maybe you could float us a small loan? Just $10,000 to cover the first few months of the lease and Julian's downtown apartment rent until he gets settled? I will pay you back with interest by Christmas. I swear on my life." I sat in my expensive office chair, utterly paralyzed by the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the request. Less than 48 hours ago, I was standing in a dirty neon vest, parking this man's car while his son publicly humiliated me. They had mocked my struggle. They had laughed at my pain. And now, because the illusion of their perfect, wealthy life was collapsing, he was shamelessly calling the exact same nephew he had treated like garbage to beg for a massive handout to save his fake golden boy. They weren't sorry. They weren't humiliated by my success. They only saw me as a sudden, highly convenient ATM machine. "Richard," I said softly, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Yes, Caleb? Anything you can do to help would save our lives right now. I want you to listen to me very carefully," I said, leaning into the phone. "I wouldn't give you 10 cents if you were begging on the street. Tell Julian to enjoy the bus." I ended the call immediately. I didn't wait for his reaction. I didn't want to hear his excuses. I picked up my phone and saved the recorded audio file. The absolute rage I felt wasn't explosive. It was highly methodical. I opened my secure laptop. I didn't go to my business files. I opened a deeply buried, password-protected Excel spreadsheet I had maintained on my personal drive for the last 7 years. I called the file Family Contributions. It wasn't an obsessive ledger. It was just a highly accurate record I kept for my own sanity, tracking every single dollar I had ever spent bailing these toxic people out of their own terrible life choices. I spent the next hour meticulously updating it, ensuring every date, every bank transfer number, and every description was perfectly accurate. Row 12. $5,000 wired directly to Liam's attorney for his custody battle. Never repaid. Row 24. $2,000 given to Aunt Beatrice to fix her leaking roof when Richard claimed he was broke. Never repaid. Row 36. $300 for Julian's expensive college textbooks when he blew his allowance on a fraternity trip. Never repaid. Row 42. The $30,000 cashier's check paid anonymously to the hospital for Grandma's life-saving heart surgery, which my mother and Beatrice had falsely credited to Julian's college fund. I carefully highlighted the bottom cell. The grand total was staggering. $45,620. $45,620. This was the exact amount of hard-earned money I had quietly handed over to a family that rewarded me by putting me at a folding table next to a trash can. I exported the file as a clean, highly readable PDF. I attached it to a new email. I added the email addresses of my mother, Aunt Beatrice, Uncle Richard, Cousin Liam, and Julian. In the subject line, I simply wrote, "The bank is permanently closed." In the body of the email, I wrote exactly 2 sentences. "You spent years mocking my business while secretly spending the money it generated. Attached is the exact cost of my forced exit from this family." I hit send. I closed my laptop. The real fallout was finally about to begin, and I was going to watch their entire world burn from the absolute safety of my corporate office. The silence that followed the email was completely deafening. I imagined the absolute panic erupting in their respective homes as they opened the PDF and saw the meticulously documented evidence of their own massive hypocrisy. I imagined my mother staring at the $30,000 hospital line item, realizing I had known her disgusting secret all along. No one texted. No one called. They were absolutely trapped by their own undeniable greed, and they knew it. I went back to work. I focused entirely on Vanguard Tech. 2 days later, my assistant knocked on my office door and told me I had a highly important phone call on line 1. It was Mr. Sterling, the wealthy logistics CEO from the graduation party. I picked up the receiver. "Mr. Sterling. Good morning." "Caleb." His deep, authoritative voice boomed through the speaker. "I have to admit, your exit from that disastrous party was one of the most incredible things I have ever witnessed in my entire professional career. Richard has always been a pretentious blowhard, but I had no idea his family dynamic was that deeply toxic." I chuckled softly. "It was a long time coming, sir." "Well, you handled yourself like a true executive," Sterling said. "And more importantly, I had my chief analysts run a deep dive on Vanguard Tech's public shipping metrics over the weekend. You weren't exaggerating. Your supply chain routing is absolutely brilliant. I want to set up a formal meeting this Thursday. I have a massive international distribution contract sitting on my desk, and I want Vanguard to handle the stateside logistics." We set the meeting. When I hung up the phone, I looked out the massive window of my office at my bustling warehouse floor. I had spent years desperately craving validation from my deeply flawed mother and my arrogant aunt. But true validation didn't come from toxic bloodlines. It came from the massive empire I had built with my own 2 hands, recognized by men who actually understood the true value of hard work. While my professional life was skyrocketing to new heights, Julian's completely fake world was rapidly collapsing into dust. Later that same week, I received a completely unexpected text message. It wasn't angry. It wasn't demanding money. It was from Julian. "Hey Caleb, I saw the email. I know you hate me right now, and you have every right to. I am so incredibly messed up. Can we please just get a coffee? No parents. Just us. I need to talk to someone who actually understands reality." I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. The power dynamic had completely, irreversibly shifted. For years, Julian had looked down on me from his artificial pedestal. Now he was at rock bottom, reaching up from the dirt. A part of me wanted to leave him on read and never speak to him again. But another part of me, the part that remembered how much pressure Aunt Beatrice had relentlessly forced onto his shoulders since childhood, was genuinely curious. I agreed to meet him at a small, quiet coffee shop located far away from his parents' affluent neighborhood. When I arrived on Saturday morning, it was raining heavily. I bought a simple black coffee and sat in a booth near the back. 10 minutes later, Julian walked in. The transformation was absolutely shocking. He wasn't wearing an expensive, custom-tailored linen suit. He was wearing a faded gray hoodie, simple jeans, and old sneakers. He looked completely exhausted. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy glow was entirely gone. He had dark, heavy bags under his bloodshot eyes, and his shoulders were slumped in total defeat. He sat down across from me. He didn't order anything. He just stared at his trembling hands resting on the wooden table. "Thank you for coming," Julian finally said, his voice quiet and completely broken. "I really didn't think you would show up." "I almost didn't," I replied flatly, taking a sip of my coffee. "What do you want, Julian? If this is another pathetic attempt to beg for lease money, you can leave right now." Julian shook his head rapidly. No, I swear to God. I don't want your money. I saw the spreadsheet you sent. I had absolutely no idea you paid for Grandma's surgery. My mom, she literally told the entire family it was from my college fund. She lied to my face. Your parents lie about a lot of things, I said coldly, including your incredible success. Julian let out a harsh, deeply bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. My success is a complete, total joke. The Porsche is gone, Caleb. The dealership sent a repo truck yesterday morning. The neighbors saw the whole thing. My dad was screaming in the driveway. It was humiliating. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I am drowning. I am 24 years old and I am $70,000 in debt. I failed every single job interview because I don't actually know how to do anything. My parents spent my entire life telling me I was a genius, telling me I deserved the corner office just for existing. They never actually taught me how to work. And when I tried to tell them I was struggling, my mom told me to just lease the car and fake it until I made it. She said looking rich was more important than actually being rich. I sat in silence, letting his heavy words settle between us. I didn't feel the intense, burning hatred anymore. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of pity. Julian wasn't a mastermind. He was a deeply damaged product of my aunt's toxic narcissism. He had been a prop in her play his entire life. The joke I made at the party, Julian whispered, wiping his eyes, mocking your online business. It wasn't even about you, Caleb. I was just so incredibly jealous. You actually built something real. You found your purpose. I was just standing there next to a car I didn't own, terrified that everyone was going to figure out I was a complete fraud. They know now, I said softly. I know, Julian replied, taking a deep, shaky breath. And that is exactly why I asked you here today. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need to do something to stop the cycle. I can't live in their fake reality anymore. He reached into the pocket of his faded hoodie and pulled out his smartphone. He didn't look at me. He unlocked the screen and opened the Instagram app. I watched in total confusion as the golden boy prepared to do the unthinkable. Julian set his phone up against the sugar dispenser on the table. He took a deep breath, ran a hand through his messy hair, and pressed the record button on his Instagram story. He had thousands of followers, former high school classmates, fraternity brothers, and the entire extended family. Hey everyone, Julian said to the camera, his voice shaking slightly but growing firmer with every word. This is a really difficult video to make, but it has to be done. A lot of you were at my graduation party last week. You saw the fancy suit, the big speeches, and the brand new Porsche. I need to come completely clean. It was all a massive, elaborate lie. I sat perfectly still in the booth, completely stunned. He was voluntarily tearing down his own highly protected facade. I don't have a massive corporate job lined up, Julian continued, looking directly into the camera lens. I am deeply, heavily in debt. The Porsche was leased, and it was officially repossessed yesterday because I couldn't afford a single payment. I have been playing a fake character for years because I was terrified of failing. But the worst part, the thing I am most ashamed of, is how I treated my cousin Caleb. He paused, swallowing hard. At the party, I publicly mocked his career. I called his incredibly successful business a little online hobby to make myself feel bigger. The truth is, Caleb is the hardest working, most brilliant person in our entire family. He built a multimillion-dollar empire from absolute scratch, completely on his own, while I was living off my parents' credit cards. He is the real deal. I am a fraud. And Caleb, if you ever see this, I am so incredibly sorry. I am stepping away from social media for a while to figure my life out and get a real job. Thanks for listening. He stopped the recording. He didn't hesitate. He hit the post button, instantly sending the confession out to his entire network, completely bypassing his parents' control. He turned the phone off and shoved it back into his pocket. He looked at me, looking lighter, as if a massive, suffocating weight had just been physically lifted off his chest. It's done. My mom is going to absolutely lose her mind when she sees that. She will probably disown me. She might, I said honestly. But for the first time in your entire life, Julian, you are actually free. Now you can start building something real. We talked for another hour. Not about toxic family politics, not about money or fancy cars, but about actual life. I gave him some tough, honest advice about starting at the absolute bottom. When we finally stood up to leave the coffee shop, Julian reached out and hugged me. It wasn't a forced family obligation hug. It was genuine. It was the hug of a guy who finally understood exactly what it took to be a man. A month later, the annual 4th of July family barbecue took place at Grandpa Joe's house. I hadn't seen most of the family since the explosive graduation party. I debated not going, but I decided I was no longer going to hide. I wasn't the one who needed to be ashamed. I arrived in my own expensive car. I walked into the backyard wearing a simple, comfortable polo shirt and dark jeans. The atmosphere was entirely different. There was no neon valet vest waiting for me. Uncle Richard didn't dare ask me to fetch ice. He actively avoided making eye contact with me, standing near the grill and looking incredibly small. Aunt Beatrice wasn't there at all. She was apparently too humiliated to show her face in public after Julian's viral Instagram video exposed her lies to all her wealthy friends. Julian was there. He was wearing an old t-shirt, and he told me he had just gotten a tough, entry-level job working in a logistics warehouse, literally loading boxes. He was exhausted, his hands were calloused, but he looked happier and more grounded than I had ever seen him. My mother, Eleanor, eventually walked up to me near the patio. She looked incredibly nervous, wringing her hands tightly. "Caleb," she started, her voice completely lacking its usual arrogant authority. "Your new house. I saw pictures online. It looks absolutely beautiful. I was hoping maybe I could come over and see it sometime. We could have dinner." She was trying to sweep years of emotional abuse and the massive hospital bill lie under the rug, hoping my new wealth would suddenly make us a happy family. I looked at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just total indifference. "No, Mom," I said calmly, maintaining a firm, polite boundary. "I don't think that is a good idea. We can be cordial at family events for Grandpa Joe's sake, but my home is my private sanctuary. I only invite people there who truly support me." She flinched as if I had physically struck her, but she didn't argue. She nodded slowly, finally accepting the brutal reality that she had permanently lost her son, and walked away. I sat down next to Grandpa Joe. He handed me a cold beer, clinked his bottle against mine, and smiled warmly. I had finally found my peace. They say that massive financial prosperity is the absolute best form of revenge against those who doubt you. But I don't entirely agree with that anymore. I believe that total, undeniable clarity is much better. The money is great, the success is validating, but the absolute greatest reward of this entire brutal journey was finally realizing that I do not owe toxic people a single seat at my table, even if we share the same blood. After years of dealing with their loud, arrogant noise, the perfect stillness of my own life is the most beautiful sound in the world. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to draw a hard line and walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace and build your own life? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Stay strong and keep building your empire.